Hey, tonight we're diving into one of history's most important social technologies. Not agriculture itself, not the invention of the wheel, not even writing, though that's close. We're talking about something that happened after you had food and before you ate it. The feast, the communal meal, the gathering where eating was never just about eating, where bread was never just bread, and where sitting down to dinner could determine your social standing for the rest of your life. For the next hour or so, we're going to watch very, very slowly as ancient Mesopotamians turned dinner into diplomacy, bread into blessing, and beer into bureaucracy. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are listening from. So, drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why you wouldn't survive a single meal in ancient Mesopotamia. Not because the food would kill you, though food poisoning was certainly a risk, but because every bite was a contract. Every cup of beer was a bond. And every moment at the feast was a performance where one wrong move could destroy your family's reputation for generations. The world's first cities were built in Mesopotamia. Uruk, Babylon, names that echo through history with the weight of civilizations that invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, law. But these cities weren't held together by walls or laws alone. They were held together by meals, shared meals, communal feasts that took days to prepare, hours to serve, and created obligations that lasted generations. This wasn't just eating. This was the social glue that made civilization possible. And it was slow, impossibly, tediously, meaningfully slow. Congratulations. You've just woken up in ancient Uruk around 3000 BCE. The sun is already climbing, hot and merciless. The kind of heat that will define your entire existence here. No air conditioning. No shade structures that actually work. Just the sun beating down on mud brick buildings that seem to absorb heat during the day and release it all night long. You're never comfortable here. That's just not an option. But the heat isn't what hits you first. It's the smell. The thick, yeasty, overwhelming smell of bread baking. Not the pleasant bakery smell you might imagine. Filtered through air conditioning and modern ventilation. This is raw, close, intense, the smell of barley bread, which is different from wheat bread, heavier, earthier, more assertive. It fills the air so completely that you can almost taste it before you've eaten anything. And underlying that bread smell is something else. The smell of smoke, of clay ovens that have been burning since before dawn, of bodies that haven't bathed in days because water is too precious to waste on washing, of animals nearby, goats and sheep and cattle that provide milk and meat and leather and are just part of the urban landscape. This is what cities smell like before plumbing, before sewers, before anyone has figured out that maybe concentrating 40,000 people in one place requires some infrastructure beyond hoping the rain washes things away. The sound reaches you next. Grinding. Constant. Rhythmic grinding. Women at grinding stones. Pushing grain back and forth. Back and forth. It's a sound so persistent it becomes almost like silence after a while. Your brain learns to filter it out the way you filter out traffic noise or air conditioning hum in the modern world, but it's always there. The soundtrack of civilization, the sound of grain becoming flour, which will become bread, which will feed the city, which will allow all of this, all of these people, all of this complexity to exist. You reach instinctively for breakfast, expecting to just grab something quick. Maybe check your phone while eating, scroll through whatever catches your attention, finish in 5 minutes, and move on with your day. There is no quick here. There is no grab and go. There is no eating while doing something else. Every meal is an event. Every act of eating is ceremony. Not because people are pretentious or making things complicated for no reason, but because producing food takes so much time, so much labor, so much coordination, that consuming it casually would be obscene, would be insulting to everyone who made it possible. You're in Uruk, around 3000 BCE, the world's first true city. 40,000 people living in one place, which doesn't sound like much compared to modern cities of millions, but represents a concentration of humanity that's completely unprecedented in human history. For most of human existence, people lived in groups of maybe 100, maybe 200 if resources were good. Now there are 40,000 of you, all needing to eat. Every single day, rain or shine, harvest or drought, peace or war. 40,000 stomachs demanding to be filled. And someone has to organize this. Someone has to decide who eats what. When, with whom, someone has to manage the storage of grain, the distribution of rations, the allocation of feast portions. Someone has to keep track of who contributed what to the temple stores, who owes what labor, who attended which feast and brought what offering. Welcome to the birth of bureaucracy. It starts with lunch. It starts with the fundamental problem of feeding a city. And it creates systems of record keeping and administration and hierarchy that will define human civilization for the next 5,000 years. A man approaches you, one of the temple administrators, judging by his slightly better quality tunic. He doesn't ask if you're coming to the feast. He informs you that you're expected, the temple is hosting, your neighborhood is attending. The alternative to going isn't just staying home and having a quiet evening. The alternative is social death, is exile from the community networks that determine whether you get help during hard times, whether your children find good marriages, whether anyone remembers your name after you're gone. So you'll go, obviously you'll go, but first, you need to understand what you're walking into. Because a Mesopotamian feast isn't like a modern dinner party where you show up, eat some food, make small talk, and go home. This is theater. This is politics. This is religion and economics and social hierarchy all performed simultaneously through the medium of shared eating. And you need to learn the rules quickly, because nobody's going to explain them to you. They expect you to already know. They expect you to absorb this through osmosis, through attending dozens of feasts throughout your life, through watching and learning the unspoken codes that govern who sits where and who eats what and who speaks when. But you didn't absorb this because you're not from here. So let's back up. Let's start with how this feast came to exist. Because feasts don't just happen. They don't spontaneously generate from goodwill and surplus food. They accumulate like water collecting in a basin, drop by drop. The feast gathers ingredients and labor and anticipation over days that stretch into weeks for major celebrations. The preparation began 3 days ago, maybe 4. The exact timing depends on the scale of the feast, the importance of the occasion, the resources available for a major temple feast like the one you're about to attend. 3 days minimum. 3 days of work by dozens of people, all coordinating their efforts, all contributing labor that they'll expect to be reciprocated at some future feast they host or attend. It started with the grain, barley. Mostly, barley is what grows here. In this hot, dry climate with irregular rainfall and soil that's salty from millennia of irrigation, wheat would be better. Wheat makes lighter, softer bread, but wheat is picky, demanding, requires better soil and more water than Mesopotamia can reliably provide. So barley it is. Barley bread, barley beer, barley as the foundation of every meal and every feast and every social obligation. The grain comes from temple storage, massive pithoi, storage jars, tall as a person, holding hundreds of pounds of grain collected as taxes, as tribute, as temple land production. The temple controls the grain supply, which means the temple controls the city. It's not complicated. Whoever has the food has the power. The rest is just details. Women. Primarily women, though. Some enslaved men, too. Began grinding this grain into flour 3 days ago. You need to understand what grinding grain actually means. Because it's not like putting wheat into a modern mill and getting flour in seconds. It's pushing grain between stones. Upper stone, lower stone. Push forward. Grain crushes. Pull back. Push again. Grain crushes more. Do this for hours. For an entire day. If you're preparing feast quantities, your arms ache. Your back screams. Your hands develop calluses on top of calluses. And the pile of flour grows with glacial slowness. Imagine spending 4 hours pushing grain between stones. Back and forth, back and forth. The motion's so repetitive it becomes automatic. Your mind going somewhere else entirely just to cope with the tedium. Your arms move. Your back bends and straightens. But your thoughts are elsewhere. On your children, on your husband, who may or may not come home from the irrigation project he's working on the neighbor who insulted you last week, on anything except the grain turning slowly, so slowly, into flour. And this is just for bread, just for the foundation of the feast, the thing people will barely notice because it's so fundamental to every meal. Bread isn't special. Bread is expected. Bread is what you eat when there's nothing else to eat and what you eat when there's everything else to eat. Bread is air, is given, is so basic that its absence would be shocking, but its presence passes without comment. 4 hours of grinding produces enough flour for maybe 20 loaves of bread. This feast will need 200 loaves. Do the math. 40 hours of grinding, spread across multiple women, over multiple days. It's manageable, barely, but it's also just one component. While the grinding happens, other preparation proceeds in parallel. The beer, we need to talk about the beer, because Mesopotamian feasts without beer aren't feasts. They're failures. Beer is more important than bread. Beer is currency. Is wages, is offering to gods, is social lubricant that makes hours of sitting with neighbors you've known your entire life somehow bearable. Beer is civilization in liquid form. Making beer from barley takes at least a week. You start by sprouting the grain, getting it damp and keeping it damp while it germinates, while the grain begins the process of becoming a plant before you interrupt it. Dry it, grind it, and turn it into the malted grain that gives beer its flavor and its alcohol. This sprouting takes 3 days. Minimum. Then you dry it, grind it, coarse, not fine like bread flour. Mix it with water and dates for sweetness, and let it ferment. Fermentation takes time. No way around this. Yeast, wild yeast that lives in the air and on everything, needs to consume the sugars in the malted barley and the dates, needs to produce alcohol and carbon dioxide, needs to transform sweet grain water into actual beer. This takes 3 to 4 days if you're lucky and the temperature is right and the yeast is vigorous. Longer if conditions aren't perfect. You cannot rush this. You can pray to the gods for good fermentation, and people do, but you cannot make it go faster through force of will. So the beer that will be consumed at this feast was started a week ago. Someone, probably a woman specialized in brewing, decided that a feast was coming and began the process. Sprouting grain, drying it, grinding it, mixing it, waiting, tasting periodically to make sure fermentation is proceeding correctly, that the beer isn't going sour or developing off flavors that would make it undrinkable. This tasting is an honor and a responsibility. Bad beer can kill people, literally. Bacterial contamination, botulism, before anyone knew what botulism was, organisms growing in the fermenting liquid that produce toxins fatal to humans. The taster puts her life on the line, or at least her stomach, testing beer to make sure it won't poison the feast attendees. She tastes. She waits a few hours. If she doesn't get sick, the beer is probably safe. It's not a perfect system, but it's the best system available in a world without microscopes or germ theory or any understanding of why food sometimes makes people sick and sometimes doesn't. We complain when the microwave takes 3 minutes to heat our food. We feel impatient when the oven needs to preheat. These people spent 3 days making beer, not because they were inefficient or didn't value their time, because beer making, actual beer making from grain, requires time, fermentation time, waiting time. Time you cannot rush unless you want vinegar instead of beer. Or worse, toxic sludge that sends half the feast attendees home with violent illness. While grain was being ground and beer was fermenting, other preparations proceeded. Fish needed to be caught. Not yesterday, not 2 days ago. Today, this morning, before the sun got too hot and the fish started to spoil in the heat, fishermen working the Euphrates, casting nets, pulling in catches, rushing them to the temple before decomposition began. Fresh fish at a feast means coordination, means labor, means someone stayed up all night fishing so that feast attendees could eat fish that tastes good rather than fish that tastes like death. Vegetables needed gathering. Onions, leeks, garlic, lentils from storage, dates from storage. Everything stored carefully in sealed vessels to keep out insects and rodents and the general decay that attacks anything edible in this climate. Someone had to inventory the storage, decide what to allocate for the feast, physically move heavy vessels from storage areas to preparation areas. More labor, more time, more coordination. And through all of this, the heat, the relentless, crushing heat that makes every physical task twice as exhausting. You're sweating constantly, losing water and salt faster than you can replace them, working anyway, because the feast is coming and the feast must happen. The feast is obligation, is expectation, is the social contract that holds the city together. You don't skip feast preparation because you're hot. You work through the heat because that's what everyone does, what everyone has always done. what everyone will continue doing until the city itself ceases to exist. Yesterday, the day before the feast, the baking began. Clay ovens, beehive-shaped structures that hold heat for hours once properly fired, were loaded with fuel, dried dung, mostly animal dung mixed with straw, formed into cakes, dried in the sun, burned as fuel because wood is scarce and expensive. The smell of burning dung is part of the smell of baking bread here. You can't separate them. Bread equals dung, smoke equals the smell that fills the city on feast days. The ovens heat for hours, too hot, and bread burns on the outside while staying raw inside. Too cool and bread comes out dense, heavy, barely edible, just right, which requires constant attention and adjustment of fuel and airflow. And you get bread that's actually good. Bread that people will eat without complaint. Bread that fulfills its social function of being so basic that nobody comments on it. 6 hours. 6 hours of managing oven temperature, of feeding fuel carefully, of checking heat levels by holding your hand near the opening and judging by feel how hot it is. No thermometers, no temperature gauge. Just experience and hand feel and the accumulated knowledge of women who've been baking bread since they were children and can tell by instinct when the oven is ready. Then the bread goes in, flat loaves, because raised bread requires techniques these bakers haven't developed yet. The dough is slapped onto the inner walls of the oven where it sticks and bakes, or placed on the oven floor if the oven is the right style. Minutes later, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15, depending on the bread thickness and oven heat, the bread is done. Golden brown, aromatic, ready to eat. One loaf done, 199 to go. The rhythm of baking becomes meditative. Load bread, wait. Remove bread, load more bread, wait. Remove bread, over and over, for hours. The women doing this work don't complain, don't protest, don't question why they're spending their entire day baking bread for a feast they'll attend, but at which they'll sit in the back. Eat last. Receive the smallest portions. This is their role. This is what women do. They make the food that makes the feast possible. The feast happens because they ground the grain and brewed the beer and baked the bread. Everyone knows this. Nobody acknowledges it explicitly. As the sun finally sets on the day before the feast, as the temperature drops from unbearable to merely uncomfortable, the preparation reaches its culmination. The bread is baked, stacked carefully, covered to keep insects away. The beer is tested one final time. Declared, ready? Sealed in jars that will be opened tomorrow during the feast. The fish are preserved in salt to make it through the night. The vegetables are sorted and ready. Everything is prepared. Days of labor by dozens of people have produced the material foundation for a feast that will last a few hours. Hours of eating, of drinking, of social performance and political maneuvering and religious observance, all made possible by this invisible labor. This is civilization. This is what cities do. They take the simple act of eating and make it so complicated that it requires professional administrators, specialized workers, detailed planning, and days of preparation. And then they pretend that the feast is spontaneous, is generous, is a gift from the temple to the community, rather than an elaborate system of labor extraction and social control. You lie down to sleep, if you can sleep in this heat, knowing that tomorrow you'll attend the feast, You'll sit where you're told to sit. Eat what you're given. Perform the social rituals expected of you. You'll do this because everyone does this. Because the alternative isn't rebellion or resistance. The alternative is exile, is being cut off from the social networks that make survival possible in a city of 40,000 people. As you drift towards sleep, you hear, faintly, the sound of grinding stones. Someone is still working, still grinding grain, because there's always more grain to grind, more bread to make, more feasts to prepare for. The work never ends. The obligations never cease. This is the price of civilization. This is what it costs to live in a city. To be part of something larger than yourself. To participate in the complex web of relationships and duties and expectations that makes urban life possible. And tomorrow, at the feast, you'll see the result. You'll see what all this labor produces. You'll see the social machine in action, converting grain and fish and beer into relationships, into hierarchy, into the invisible structures that organize 40,000 people into something resembling a coherent society. You'll see it. You'll participate in it. You'll contribute to it. And then, in a few months, you'll do it all again. Because the feast is never one feast. It's an endless cycle of preparation and performance and obligation, repeated over and over, generation after generation, until the cycle itself becomes culture, becomes identity, becomes the way things are done and have always been done and will always be done. The grinding stones fall silent. Finally, someone has ground enough flour for now. Tomorrow the work begins again. But tonight, for a few hours, there's rest. Tomorrow, there's the feast. Tomorrow, you'll learn what it actually means to eat in ancient Mesopotamia, what it costs, what it creates, what it destroys. Tomorrow, you'll understand why civilizations are built on bread and beer and the whispered rituals that transform eating into obligation. Morning arrives not gently but insistently. The sun doesn't ease into the sky here. It climbs fast and hot, announcing its presence with heat that penetrates the mud brick walls of your shelter before you've fully opened your eyes. You've been awake for a while already, lying still, reluctant to begin the day, because beginning the day means attending the feast, and attending the feast means performing, constantly performing, for hours in the presence of everyone who matters in your social world. You rise because everyone rises, because staying home isn't an option, and even if it were, the social cost would follow you for months, years, possibly. The woman who didn't attend the temple feast, the family that thought themselves too good, or too aggrieved, or too something to participate in communal obligations. That story would be told and retold until it became part of your identity, eclipsing everything else about you. The courtyard where the feast will be held is already filling when you arrive. Not because you're late. You're actually early, arriving as the sun is still low, before the heat becomes truly oppressive. But others are earlier still, the most punctual, the most eager to demonstrate their devotion, or perhaps just the most anxious about securing good positions. They're already here, standing in loose groups, making the kind of small talk that fills time without requiring actual communication. You take your place, not just anywhere. There's a geography to this gathering, an unspoken map of who stands near whom. Family groups clustered together, maintaining their identity as units even within the larger crowd. Neighbors from your district, form a loose association, not quite organized, but definitely present as a recognizable group. And carefully, very carefully, people maintain distance from those they're in conflict with. Not obvious distance. That would be insulting. An open declaration of hostility, but enough space that they won't be forced into conversation, won't be trapped in awkward proximity for the hours ahead. You watch people arriving. This is anthropology in real time. This is seeing social structure made visible through the simple act of people choosing where to stand. The wealthy merchants arrive and immediately command space. Other people shifting slightly to accommodate them, to give them room that nobody explicitly offered, but everyone provides. Temple officials enter and the crowd parts, not dramatically, not like some biblical sea-parting miracle, but through dozens of small adjustments as people step back, creating a path without being asked. Children run briefly before parents catch them and pull them back with sharp whispers about appropriate behavior. This isn't a playground. This is serious. This is where reputations are maintained or destroyed, where alliances are displayed, where every action is observed and judged and remembered. Children need to learn this, need to understand that their behavior reflects on their entire family. So they're grabbed, corrected, told to stand still and be quiet and watch the adults to learn how proper people behave. The waiting begins. The feast doesn't start when the food is ready. Everyone knows the food is ready. You can smell it. Bread, fish, the yeasty tang of beer being opened. The food has been ready since before dawn, but the feast doesn't start when the food is ready. It starts when the appropriate official decides the appropriate moment has arrived. This could be minutes from now. This could be hours. Nobody knows. Everyone waits. This waiting isn't passive. It's active social work. You make eye contact with people you know. Nod acknowledgement. Occasionally exchange a few words. You very carefully don't make eye contact with people you're avoiding. You watch to see who arrives together, who arrives separately but immediately seeks each other out, who maintains distance despite being in the same social circles. Every interaction, every non-interaction communicates information. You're reading the social landscape, updating your mental map of who's allied with whom, who's feuding, who's trying to repair relationships, who's signaling new connections. A man, a merchant who trades in dates and honey moves closer to you, not right next to you. That would be presumptuous, but close enough that conversation is possible. He comments on the weather, which is hot, like it's always hot, like everyone knows it's hot. You agree that yes, it's hot. This is small talk elevated to art form. You're not talking about weather. You're establishing that you're willing to be seen talking to each other. That whatever happened last year when his cousin accused your brother of shortchanging him on a pottery order hasn't created permanent hostility between your families. More people arrive. The courtyard fills. 40, 50, 60 people, maybe more. You're not counting. Nobody's counting, but you're aware of the density of the way the crowd is reaching capacity, of how much longer you'll be able to maintain personal space before the crush becomes uncomfortable. And still you wait. The sun climbs higher. The heat intensifies. People are sweating now, shifting their weight from foot to foot, fanning themselves with whatever's available. The excitement of arrival has faded into the tedium of waiting. But nobody complains. Complaining would mark you as impatient, as disrespectful of the temple's timing, as someone who prioritizes personal comfort over communal obligation. So you stand You sweat, you wait. Finally, movement at the front of the courtyard. A priest emerges from the temple proper, dressed in his ceremonial garments, carrying a vessel, not just any vessel, the expensive one, the one reserved for ritual use, made by the best potter in the city and marked with symbols that identify it as temple property. This is the libation vessel. This is how the feast will begin. Not with eating, but with offering. The crowd quiets immediately. The chattering stops. Parents grab children more firmly. Everyone turns their attention to the priest. He stands at the small altar, raises the vessel, and begins to chant. In Sumerian, which is ancient even now, a liturgical language that few people actually understand conversationally, but everyone recognizes as the language of ritual, of communication with the divine. The words wash over you. You don't understand them. Not really. You know this is a hymn to Inanna, the goddess of fertility and war and a dozen other things, including, apparently, feasts. The goddess who ensures abundance, who makes the barley grow, who blesses the beer with fermentation, who watches over communal gatherings and either smiles or frowns depending on whether proper respect has been shown. The priest is invoking her, asking her blessing, offering her the first portion of the feast that's about to begin. He pours beer from the vessel onto the ground. Expensive beer, beer that costs 3 days of labor to make, beer that could feed, or rather, intoxicate several people. It soaks into the earth in seconds. The goddess has received her portion, or the ground has received beer while everyone pretends it's gone to the goddess. Either way, the ritual is complete. The invisible beings who supposedly govern the cosmos have been honored. Now the humans can eat. But wait, there's more ritual first. Because of course there is. A priest brings forward a loaf of bread, not ordinary bread, special bread, made with the finest flour, sifted multiple times to remove any bran or coarseness, baked in a special mold that gives it a shape that signifies its sacred purpose. This bread probably took 8 hours to make from start to finish. 8 hours for one loaf, and it's being placed in front of a statue of Inanna, gold-plated, wearing elaborate jewelry, seated in a position of honor at the head of the courtyard. Everyone bows. You bow. You watch the statue. The statue does not eat the bread. This doesn't surprise anyone. Nobody actually expects the statue to eat. But the ritual requires the offering, requires the performance of presenting food to the divine before humans can consume it. The bread will sit there for the duration of the feast. And then later, much later, priests will consume it. Because food offered to gods can't just be wasted, can't be thrown away. So it passes to the priests, who serve as intermediaries between human and divine. The waiting continues, but now with a different quality. Now you're waiting not for the feast to begin, but for your turn to eat. Because eating doesn't happen all at once. Eating happens in waves, in carefully orchestrated order, in a sequence that makes visible the entire social hierarchy of the city. The priests eat first. This surprises no one. They're closest to the gods. They organize the feast. They control the food supply. Of course, they eat first. They seat themselves, or rather, they were already seated on actual chairs, which is luxury most people never experience. Chairs are expensive, are marks of status, are furniture that announces important people. Sit here. Servants bring them food. And what food? Meat, which most people see maybe once a month, if they're lucky. Roasted goat, the smell making your mouth water, despite the heat, despite the long wait, despite everything. White bread, that specially sifted bread that's soft and light and takes twice as long to make as regular bread. Date wine, which is expensive, which is imported or at least made from imported dates, which is sweet and strong and signals wealth and connections. They eat slowly, not because the food is too hot or they're not hungry, but because eating slowly is dignified. Rushing would be undignified, would suggest they're peasants who don't know better, who grab at food like animals. So they eat with deliberate slowness, taking small bites, pausing between mouthfuls, conducting quiet conversations while they eat, performing their status through the unhurried consumption of the best food available. You watch this. Everyone watches this. This is part of the feast. Watching the hierarchy made visible through food distribution. You're not resentful. Exactly. You're not shocked or outraged. This is how things work. This is how things have always worked. Priests eat first and best. That's the price of their intercession with the gods. Their management of temple resources. Their literacy and education and specialized knowledge, or at least that's how it's explained. That's the official story. Whether you believe it or question it quietly in your own mind, you keep that to yourself and watch them eat. The second wave begins. Skilled workers, the ones whose labor makes the city function. Scribes who can read and write cuneiform. Master potters whose work is sought after across the region. Successful merchants who trade in valuable goods. They're called forward. Not all at once, but in small groups, directed by temple attendants who know exactly who belongs in which category, who's earned the right to eat in the second wave. They don't get chairs. They sit on mats. Woven reed mats that provide minimal cushioning against the hard ground, but at least mark out defined spaces for eating. They receive portions noticeably smaller than what the priests got. Same types of food, but less of it, a smaller piece of meat, less white bread, watered wine instead of full strength. The message is clear. You're important. You're valued. You're necessary to the functioning of the city. You're just not as important as priests. They eat. You watch. More waiting. But you're hungry now. Actually hungry. Because you skipped breakfast knowing you'd eat at the feast. And watching other people eat while you stand and wait is activating every instinct that says food. Want food. Need food. You control yourself. Everyone controls themselves. Grabbing at food. Demanding to be served. Showing visible signs of hunger-driven impatience. These would all be terrible breaches of proper behavior. The third wave, this is where you are. The broad middle of urban society, people who work with their hands but aren't enslaved. People who own small amounts of property. People who participate in city life without controlling any significant portion of its resources. The majority, the people who make everything work through the aggregate of their small contribution. You're called forward. You sit on the ground. No mats for this group. The ground is hard, is dirty, is uncomfortable. You sit anyway, because sitting means you're about to eat. Finally, after hours of standing and waiting and performing patience, you don't entirely feel around you. Your neighbors do the same. Family groups stay together, sitting in loose clusters, maintaining their identity even in this mass seating. Food arrives, not brought by servants, not individually served, but set out in communal vessels. Large bowls of lentil stew, thick with onions and garlic and herbs that make it actually taste good despite being made from the cheapest ingredients available. Bread, good bread, brown bread made from barely sifted flour, still delicious, still warm, still the staff of life that makes everything else possible. Beer, plenty of beer, in large jars with long reed straws sticking out, and fish, not the choicest cuts, not the fatty portions that went to higher status diners, but fish nonetheless. Protein, flavor, variety. The fish is salty from preservation, is a bit tough from being caught yesterday rather than this morning. But it's fish, it's food, and you're hungry enough that it tastes wonderful. You eat with your hands. There are no utensils. Forks won't be invented for thousands of years. Spoons exist but aren't provided for communal feasts. You tear bread, use it to scoop lentils. Grab chunks of fish with fingers that will be oily and sticky for hours. Everyone around you does the same. This isn't gross by local standards. This is normal. This is how humans eat. The idea that touching food with your hands is somehow wrong or dirty would seem bizarre here. How else would you eat? How else would you know the temperature, the texture, the readiness of food, except through direct touch? The pace of eating is different here than in the higher waves. People eat faster, more eagerly, with less performance of dignity and more simple satisfaction at finally getting food. Not rushing, exactly, but not dawdling either. You eat steadily, substantially, filling your belly with bread and lentils and beer. The beer's good, better than you expected. Whoever brewed this batch knew what they were doing. It's smooth, slightly sweet from dates, with that distinctive barley flavor that makes you feel connected to the land, to the grain, to the fundamental cycle of planting and harvesting that makes everything here possible. Around you, conversations begin now that people have food in front of them. Now that the tension of waiting has broken, people talk, real talk, not just small talk. News is exchanged. Information flows. This is social media before social media. The original version where you can't block anyone and everyone sees everything because you're sitting right there. A man near you mentions that the irrigation canal in the northern district needs repair. Several people respond with their observations about water flow, about silt buildup, about whether the temple will allocate labor for the repair, or whether neighborhoods will have to organize their own work parties. This seems boring. This seems mundane. But this is how cities function. This is information exchange that directly affects everyone's survival. If the canal fails, if water doesn't reach the fields, if the harvest fails, everyone here could starve. So canal maintenance isn't boring. It's existential. A woman discusses her daughter's upcoming marriage, not gossiping, sharing information that redraws social maps. Her daughter is marrying into a potter's family from the southern district. This creates alliance between families, between neighborhoods, between skill groups. The woman's son is a weaver. Now weavers and potters have family connection. Future trades become easier. Future conflicts have built-in mediation. This marriage announcement, delivered casually while eating fish, has political implications that will ripple through the community for years. You contribute little to these conversations. You listen more than you speak. Still learning the social landscape, still figuring out who's aligned with whom, who's feuding, who has influence, who's marginal. Every feast is education, is data collection, is the slow accumulation of social knowledge that allows you to navigate urban life without making catastrophic mistakes. The beer jars circulate. You don't drink from individual cups. The beer is in large jars, and everyone shares. Long reed straws stick out of each jar, and people take turns drinking. You put your mouth where other people's mouths have been. You share saliva. Share whatever illnesses might be circulating. Share the intimate act of drawing liquid from the same source. This isn't unhygienic by local standards. This is community. This is trust made physical. This is literally sharing the same source of nourishment, the same intoxication, the same moment of consumption. You drink deeply. The beer is good. The beer is making the heat slightly more bearable, is making the hard ground slightly more comfortable, is making your neighbors slightly more interesting. You understand why beer is central to these feasts. Beer doesn't just provide calories and hydration. It provides the social lubrication that makes hours of sitting with the same people endurable. It creates the mild euphoria that transforms obligation into something approaching pleasure. More food appears, not because you're still hungry. Most people have had plenty, but because the feast has to dispose of all the prepared food. Waste would be unthinkable. So additional bread is brought out. More fish. More lentil stew. People eat more slowly now, picking at food rather than devouring it. But still eating because the food is there, and refusing it would be insulting. And anyway, who knows when you'll eat this well again? A temple official stands and announces that anyone who wishes may bring forward offerings. This is the moment where individual families can present contributions to the temple, can demonstrate their generosity, or at least their willingness to participate in the gift economy that underlies all of this. You watch people approach the designated area carrying whatever they've brought. Some bring jars of beer, their own brewing, added to the communal supply. Some bring bread, supplementing the temple's provision. One family presents a small basket of dates, precious and sweet. Another offers a length of woven cloth, probably weeks of work compressed into a textile that will be recorded and redistributed by temple administrators. A scribe sits at the edge of the courtyard, stylus and tablet ready, recording every offering. Who brought what? How much? Of what quality? This record will be kept for years. Will be consulted when people need temple assistance. When famines come, when someone needs to prove their loyalty and participation in communal life, every gift is logged. Every contribution is noted. The database is being updated in real time, except instead of computers and servers, it's clay tablets that will be filed away in temple archives and referenced whenever necessary. You didn't bring anything. You're new here, still establishing yourself, still learning the rules. Nobody comments on your lack of contribution, but people notice. Of course they notice. At the next feast, you'll be expected to bring something, not because anyone will directly demand it, but because the social pressure, the silent observation, the slow accumulation of judgment will make not contributing unbearable. This is how the system perpetuates itself, not through force, but through the quiet power of communal expectation and public recording. The eating continues. The afternoon wears on. The heat intensifies, then slowly begins to fade as the sun angles toward evening. People are still eating, still talking, but the energy is changing. The initial excitement has passed. The hunger has been satisfied. Now it's just the long middle of the feast, the hours that stretch on, where you're neither eager to stay nor quite ready to leave. where you're trapped in the social expectation that you'll remain until it's appropriate to depart. And the appropriateness of departure is determined by hierarchy, same as everything else. Important people will leave first. Their departure signals that the feast is winding down. Only after they've gone can people of your status begin to leave without insulting the host or appearing disrespectful. So you wait again. Still, you've been waiting all day in various forms, waiting to arrive, waiting for the feast to start, waiting to eat, and now waiting for permission, unspoken but real, to go home. As the sun finally touches the horizon, as the crushing heat begins its slow retreat into merely oppressive warmth, the priests stand. They're leaving. They've eaten. They've overseen the rituals. They've received offerings. They've fulfilled their role. Their departure creates a cascade. The second-tier people stand shortly after. Then your group begins to rise, stretching legs that have been sitting too long, gathering yourselves, preparing to navigate the social minefield of departure. You don't just walk away. You have to acknowledge the host, which in this case is the temple, which means acknowledging whatever priest is designated as the official host of this particular feast. You approach, you bow slightly. You express gratitude in the formal phrases everyone uses. The priest nods, accepts your thanks, marks you mentally as having fulfilled your obligation. You've attended, you've eaten, you've shown proper respect. The social contract has been honored. You leave the courtyard. The walk home feels longer than the walk there, despite being the same distance. You're full, almost uncomfortably full, bloated with bread and lentils and beer. Your mouth tastes like fish and onions. Your fingers are still sticky despite rubbing them with sand to clean them. Your back aches from sitting on hard ground for hours. You're exhausted, not from physical labor, but from the mental effort of constant social awareness, constant performance, constant navigation of unspoken rules and invisible hierarchies. But you're also satisfied in a way that has nothing to do with food. You've participated. You've been seen participating. You've been recorded as present, as properly respectful, as a functioning member of urban society. For the next few months, until the next major feast, you can relax slightly. You've fulfilled this obligation. You've paid this social debt. You can coast on the credit that attendance has earned you. The evening air is cooler now, almost pleasant. The city is quieter, people returning to their homes. The streets emptying as families retreat into private spaces after hours of compulsory publicity. You pass others from the feast. Exchange nods. Maintain the social connections that were reinforced today. Tomorrow you'll wake and the memory of fullness will be fading. Tomorrow there will be work, whatever work you do to survive in this city. But tonight, you're fed. Tonight, you're connected. Tonight, you're part of something larger than yourself. And in a few months, you'll do it all again. Because the feast isn't one event. It's a cycle, a rhythm, a heartbeat that pulses through urban life. Preparation, attendance, recovery, and eventually, preparation again. This is how cities work. This is how humans convert food into society, meals into meaning, eating into identity. One feast at a time, one obligation at a time, one performance at a time. Slowly, exhaustingly, endlessly, you wake the morning after the feast with a headache. Not a terrible headache, but a persistent dull ache that sits behind your eyes and reminds you that you drank more beer yesterday than your body is accustomed to processing. The beer was good. The beer was plentiful. The beer is now making you regret several decisions you made between the fourth and seventh jar. But this is normal. This is the expected consequence of proper feast attendance. If you don't have a mild headache the next morning, you probably didn't drink enough beer to be properly sociable. The city around you is quieter than usual. Other people are experiencing similar morning after sensations. Work will happen today, because work always happens, because the irrigation channels don't care about your headache and the barley doesn't grow itself. But work will happen more slowly, with more breaks, with less enthusiasm. The day after a feast is a recovery day disguised as a regular day. Everyone knows this. Nobody acknowledges it officially. You think about yesterday's feast as you move through morning routines, washing face and hands with precious water, breaking fast with leftover bread that's already going stale in this heat, preparing for whatever labor the day demands. But your mind keeps returning to moments from the feast, not just the eating, but the rituals embedded within the eating, the moments when consumption stopped being merely practical and became something else, something sacred, something that connected you not just to your neighbors, but to forces beyond human control. At some point during yesterday's feast, eating stopped being just eating. You're not sure exactly when. The transition was subtle, unmarked by any obvious signal. But you remember the moment you became aware of it? A priest had stood. The crowd had quieted instantly. That collective hush that happens when something important is about to occur. You'd been chewing bread, and you'd stopped chewing, held the bread in your mouth, waiting to see what would happen next. The priest had begun to chant, not in the everyday Akkadian that people use for market transactions and family arguments. In Sumerian, ancient Sumerian, the language of the old gods. The language that was already ancient when your grandparents were young. The language that nobody speaks conversationally anymore, but everyone recognizes as the tongue of the divine. The words washed over the crowd, incomprehensible to most, meaningful to all. You didn't understand the words, not individually, but you understood the context. This was a hymn to Inanna, the great goddess, the queen of heaven, the mistress of fertility and warfare, and apparently also communal feasts, the goddess who makes barley grow and beer ferment and communities cohere. The goddess whose favor determines whether the city prospers or collapses, whether harvests are abundant or fail, whether the next generation is born healthy or dies in infancy. The priest's voice rose and fell in patterns that felt ancient, that felt rehearsed over centuries, that felt like they connected directly to something fundamental about being human in this place. You didn't need to understand the words. You needed to feel the weight of them, the seriousness, the connection to forces beyond the immediate, beyond the mundane business of eating and drinking and maintaining social status. Everyone had bowed their heads. You'd bowed yours. Some people you'd noticed had seemed genuinely moved, genuinely transported by the moment, their eyes closed, their faces composed in expressions of reverence that looked real rather than performed. Other people had maintained appropriate, respectful postures while their eyes stayed alert, watching the crowd, calculating social positions, thinking about whatever practical concerns occupied their minds beneath the veneer of piety. You'd been somewhere in between, not deeply spiritual, not coldly calculating, just present, participating in a ritual that was larger than any individual's belief or disbelief. The ritual worked not because everyone believed it, but because everyone performed it. The performance itself was the power the collective act of acknowledging something beyond individual concerns, even if that acknowledgement was purely social rather than genuinely spiritual. This is religion. You'd thought this is how it actually functions, not through individual conviction necessarily, but through collective participation, through the agreement that yes, we will all bow our heads when the priest chants. We will all maintain silence during sacred moments. We will all perform reverence regardless of our private thoughts. And through that collective performance, something emerges. Call it social cohesion. Call it divine favor. Call it whatever you want. But something happens when 40 people simultaneously agree to treat a moment as sacred. The hymn to Inanna had lasted perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps longer. Time becomes strange during ritual. The priest's voice maintained its rising-falling pattern, the ancient words flowing in sequences that had been memorized and repeated by countless priests before him, creating a thread of continuity stretching back through time to the city's founding, to the first temples, to the moment when humans decided that invisible forces governed their fates, and those forces needed to be acknowledged, honored, appeased. When the chanting ended, the silence had lingered for a moment. Nobody wanted to be the first to break the sacred atmosphere, to return to the mundane business of eating and drinking. Then someone had coughed. Another person had shifted position, and the spell had broken. Life resumed. People returned to their bread and beer. But something had shifted. The feast had been transformed. Briefly, from social obligation into religious observance. And that transformation mattered, even if you couldn't quite articulate why. Now, the morning after, you think about the foods that carry sacred significance. The foods that aren't just nutrition, but symbol, meaning connection to cosmic order. Dates, for instance. You'd eaten dates yesterday. Sweet and sticky. A luxury that most people access only at feasts or during illness when their medicinal properties are needed more than their flavor. Dates are sacred because date palms take 7 years to fruit. 7 years. Think about that. You plant a date palm sapling and you wait. You water it. You protect it from animals and weather and human interference. You maintain it through seasons and years, and only after 7 full cycles of planting and harvesting other crops does the date palm finally produce fruit. This makes dates inherently sacred. This makes them metaphors for everything good that requires patience, which is everything. Really, everything worth having takes time. The date palms themselves are called the tree of life in hymns and prayers. They provide not just fruit, but wood for construction, fronds for weaving, fiber for rope, shade for smaller plants. They're the foundation of oasis agriculture, the reason humans can survive in this hot, dry landscape, and they take 7 years to establish. 7 years of faith that, yes, this investment will pay off, that patience will be rewarded, that the cosmos operates on principles that reward those who wait. Eating dates at the feast wasn't just eating sweets. It was consuming concentrated patience. It was participating in a cycle of growth and harvest that spans years, that connects you to farmers who planted palms before you were born, whose labor you're now enjoying, whose faith in the future made your present consumption possible. Every date is a prayer to patience. Every bite is acknowledgement that good things come to those who wait. And 7 years is a long time to wait. Barley, too, carries sacred weight, not because it takes 7 years. Quite the opposite. Barley is fast, Barley grows in a single season. Plant in autumn, harvest in spring. But barley is sacred for different reasons. Barley is the reason cities exist. Barley grows here when wheat won't. Barley tolerates the heat, the salt in the soil from millennia of irrigation, the irregular flooding of the rivers. Barley is reliable in a way that wheat isn't. Wheat is better, everyone agrees. Wheat makes lighter bread, softer bread, bread that doesn't sit heavy in your stomach. But wheat is picky. Wheat demands conditions that Mesopotamia can't consistently provide. So barley it is. Barley bread, barley beer. Barley is the foundation of everything. You're not eating bread when you eat barley bread. You're consuming compressed civilization. You're eating the grain that made cities possible, that allowed 40,000 people to live in one place, that created the agricultural surplus, that freed some people to become priests and scribes and potters instead of everyone being farmers. Barley is the reason you exist in this city rather than living in a small agricultural village growing your own food. Barley is the foundation. Everything else builds on barley. The fish you ate yesterday carried its own significance. Fish from the Tigris and Euphrates, the twin rivers that define this land, that make agriculture possible through their flooding, that provide water for irrigation and drinking and the occasional bath. Fish are abundance made visible. Fish require no planting, no cultivation, no harvest labor. They simply exist in the rivers. Free food for anyone with nets and time. Fresh fish at a feast signals more than just protein availability. It signals that the host has connections, has access to fishermen willing to wake before dawn and cast nets in the pre-dawn darkness, has the labor network to transport fish quickly from river to feast site before the heat causes spoilage, has the social capital to ensure delivery on the specific day needed. You're not eating fish. You're consuming political networks. You're ingesting the web of relationships that makes fresh fish appear at the right moment in the right place. At some point during the feast, you'd notice priests examining bread, not eating it, examining it. They'd broken loaves in half, studied the interior texture, the way the crust had formed, the pattern of air pockets in the crumb. They've been reading omens, divination through baked goods, the future revealed in carbohydrates. This practice always strikes you as slightly absurd, though you'd never say so aloud. The idea that how bread bakes in a clay oven can reveal cosmic truths about the future seems, well, optimistic, but the priests take it seriously. They examine the bread with intense concentration, noting which loaves have good cracks on top, which are too dense, which baked unevenly. Good cracks mean good fortune. Dense crumb means obstacles ahead. Neven baking suggests social discord. Perfect bread indicates divine approval. The bread looked fine to you. The bread always looks fine. It's bread. It baked. It's edible. But apparently there are subtleties invisible to untrained eyes. The priests see patterns, meanings, messages from the gods embedded in the very structure of bread, or they claim to, or they've convinced themselves they do, or they're maintaining a tradition that gives them interpretive authority over random events, allowing them to frame whatever happens as predicted, foreseen, aligned with cosmic will. The war with Elam that everyone knows is coming will happen regardless of bread texture. But everyone feels better having consulted the bread, having performed the ritual of seeking divine guidance before making major decisions. The bread prophecy will be ambiguous enough to fit whatever outcome occurs. The dense areas suggest difficulty, which we overcame through valor. The good cracks foretold our victory, which the gods granted. The prophecy adapts to results. This is how divination maintains credibility despite having no actual predictive power. But it makes people feel better, makes them feel connected to forces beyond human control, makes the randomness of existence feel slightly less random. Throughout the feast, there had been music. You'd barely noticed it at first. So focused on the social navigation and the food and the hierarchy and the thousand small things demanding attention. But music had been playing constantly. A lyre player, seated near the priests, playing songs that were probably ancient, probably traditional, probably the same songs played at every feast for generations. The melodies were familiar. In that way, things become familiar through repetition, even if you couldn't hum them accurately or name them if asked. The songs were about gods, about heroes, about proper behavior and cosmic order, about the great flood that supposedly happened generations ago, about Gilgamesh and his quest for immortality, about Inanna's descent to the underworld and return. Stories told through music, preserved through performance, passed down from musician to apprentice across years and decades. Nobody was really listening. Everyone was eating, talking, conducting the social business that was the real purpose of the gathering. But the music mattered. Its presence mattered. Silence during a feast would have been deeply uncomfortable, would have made every conversation too audible, would have created a tension that the soft background of lyre music prevented. The music-filled space made conversation easier, provided rhythm to the event without demanding attention. The musician was a professional temple employee, trained since childhood, fed regular rations from temple stores in exchange for providing this service. His job was to make feasts feel sacred, to create atmospheric holiness through sound, to transform ordinary eating into ceremony through the addition of ancient melodies played on traditional instruments. He was good at it. The lyre sounded beautiful, its tones pure and clear, hanging in the hot air, before fading into the general noise of crowd and conversation. You wouldn't remember the melodies this morning. Nobody would. The music was designed not to be memorable, but to be appropriate, to set a mood, to fill silence, to signal that this was a proper feast with proper observances rather than just people eating together. The musician had fulfilled his function perfectly by being good enough to notice, but not interesting enough to distract. Background holiness, sacred wallpaper, the soundtrack of civilization. Children had been present at the feast, though you'd barely notice them in all the social complexity demanding your attention. But they'd been there, sitting with their families, watching everything, absorbing the unspoken rules through observation rather than instruction. This was education. This was how social structures transmitted themselves across generations, not through lectures or formal teaching, but through thousands of meals where children watched and learned. They learned who sat where, who spoke to whom, who received honored portions and who ate last. They learned that patience was expected, that grabbing at food was shameful, that your behavior reflected on your entire family. They learned that silence during sacred moments was mandatory, that respect for priests was automatic, that the social order was natural and inevitable rather than constructed and maintained. One child had run between seated groups. You'd seen it happen. The child, maybe 5 years old, had broken free from parental control and sprinted through the crowd, laughing, delighting in movement and speed and the pure joy of being a small human body in motion. The parent had reacted instantly, not with violence, not with shouting, but with firm correction. The child had been grabbed, pulled back, spoken to in sharp whispers. The child's face had crumpled. The joy had evaporated. The lesson had been learned. The lesson wasn't that running is dangerous, though it could be in a crowded feast. The lesson was that disrupting the feast's order was social offense. That individual impulses don't matter when communal cohesion is at stake, that your desires are subordinate to group functioning. That conformity is expected, and deviation is corrected immediately. Harsh, maybe, by modern standards. Definitely harsh, but effective, undeniably effective. These children would grow up knowing exactly how society worked, knowing their place, knowing the rules, knowing what behaviors brought approval and what brought correction. They'd internalize hierarchy so completely that challenging it would feel not just dangerous but wrong, unnatural, a violation of cosmic order rather than merely social convention. The children had received smaller portions than adults, not equal shares despite equal hunger. They hadn't contributed labor to feast preparation. They hadn't paid social dues. They weren't full members of the community yet, so they received enough to not be hungry, but not enough to be full. They received lessons in delayed gratification, in earning your place, in understanding that full bellies come through social participation rather than as birthright. You'd watched a young girl, maybe 8 years old, accept her small portion of bread and fish without complaint. She'd eaten slowly, making it last. Watching the adults receive larger portions with an expression you couldn't quite read. Acceptance, resentment, understanding that someday she'd be an adult receiving full portions, all of those probably mixed together. She was learning that life wasn't fair in any abstract sense, learning that you got what your social position entitled you to receive, learning that patience and conformity eventually resulted in advancement through the hierarchy if you lived long enough and performed properly. As the morning after the feast continues, as your headache slowly fades and the city returns to its normal rhythm of work and obligation, you think about what the feast actually was, not just eating, not just social gathering, but a complex performance where the sacred and mundane intertwined so completely that separating them became impossible. You'd eaten bread and fish. You'd also consumed hierarchy, participated in religious ritual, demonstrated social compliance, renewed communal bonds, and transmitted cultural values to the next generation. The feast was theater, was education, was religion, was politics, was all of these simultaneously, none of them quite separable from the others. You performed your role adequately, not brilliantly. You weren't trying to stand out, but adequately. You'd shown up, eaten appropriately, maintained proper demeanor, acknowledged your place in the social order. You'd done what was expected, which was exactly what was expected. In a few months, there would be another feast. Different occasion, maybe different foods, possibly, but same fundamental structure, same hierarchy made visible through food distribution, same rituals embedded in eating, same children watching and learning, same performance of community that held the city together through the accumulation of shared meals and mutual obligations. This was civilization, not the monuments or the laws or the great works that historians would remember, but this, the feast, the gathering, the slow conversion of food into meaning, the patient construction of social order through thousands of meals where people sat together and ate together and agreed tacitly that, yes, This is how things are done. This is who we are. This is what holds us together. As afternoon arrives and work demands attention, you let the memories of the feast fade into that comfortable background place where social memories live. The feast happened. You attended. The obligations were met. The cycle continues. And somewhere, someone is already grinding grain for the next feast, for the next gathering, for the next performance of community that will happen in a few months, when the seasons turn and the calendar demands another moment, when everyone stops working and starts eating together. The grinding stones turn. The grain becomes flour. The flour will become bread. The bread will be eaten at the next feast. And the cycle continues, generation after generation, until the cycle itself becomes invisible, becomes natural, becomes just the way things are and have always been and always will be. This is how civilization perpetuates itself, not through force or brilliance or dramatic innovation, but through repetition, through ritual, through the patient accumulation of shared meals that gradually you barely notice it happening, transform a collection of individuals into something approaching a community. Slowly, ritually, endlessly, the whispered rituals of ancient Mesopotamian communal feasts, chapter 4, the feast as politics. 3 days after the feast, you're called to witness a dispute, not formally, not with any legal summons or official notification, but word spreads through your neighborhood that two men are bringing their conflict before the community. And your presence is expected, not optional. Expected because disputes in Mesopotamian cities aren't resolved behind closed doors in private negotiations. They're resolved publicly, in front of witnesses, where everyone can see and hear and judge and remember. The dispute is mundane enough. A property boundary issue. Two neighbors who share a wall between their compounds disagree about where exactly that boundary lies. One claims the other has encroached by building a storage room that extends 6 inches past the proper line. The other insists that the boundary has always been where it currently is, that no encroachment has occurred, that the complaint is fabricated to cause trouble. 6 inches, that's what this is about. 6 inches of mud brick wall. In a city of 40,000 people, where wars are fought and temples rise and fall and entire dynasties come and go, these two men are arguing about 6 inches of property line, and everyone is taking it seriously because property is fundamental, because boundaries matter, because if you let one person shift a boundary by 6 inches without challenge, soon everyone's boundaries become negotiable, and property itself becomes meaningless. The hearing will take place at the next communal meal, not a major feast like the one you attended a few days ago, but a smaller neighborhood gathering, the kind that happens monthly or so, where 30 or 40 families come together for an evening meal and to handle collective business. The feast becomes the courthouse. The meal becomes the trial. Justice and eating merge into a single event, because separating them would be inefficient. And anyway, why would you want to? When the evening arrives, you walk to the neighborhood gathering place, a courtyard shared by several extended families, large enough to accommodate the expected crowd. The smell of cooking fish reaches you before you see the actual gathering. Someone has been grilling fish over open coals, the smoke and aroma announcing that food is ready or nearly ready, that the meal will begin soon. The courtyard is already full. People sit in their usual family groups, maintaining the social geography that exists at every gathering. But there's a different energy tonight. People are quieter, more alert. Everyone knows about the dispute. Everyone has opinions. The two men in conflict are both present, sitting with their respective families, maintaining careful distance from each other. Neither looks happy. Both look resigned. the way people look when they're about to have their affairs discussed publicly, and there's nothing they can do to prevent it. The meal begins with the usual rituals. Brief prayers, symbolic offerings, acknowledgement of the gods who watch over neighborhood gatherings, even if the gods probably have bigger concerns than property disputes in one small district of Uruk. Then food is distributed, not in waves based on status. This is a neighborhood gathering rather than a temple feast, but in rough order of age and family importance. Elders eat first. Large families receive generous portion. Small families and single individuals wait longer but eventually get fed. You eat slowly. The fried fish, greasy and delicious. The bread warm and substantial. The beer weak but refreshing. Around you, people eat and talk in low voices, discussing the dispute, taking sides, forming opinions about who's right and who's wrong and what the appropriate resolution should be. This isn't random gossip. This is the community forming consensus before the formal proceedings begin. When most people have finished eating, when the immediate hunger has been satisfied and people are ready to focus on something besides food, one of the neighborhood elders stands. He's old, maybe 70, which is extraordinary. In a world where most people die before 50, his survival to this age gives him authority. He's seen disputes before. He's participated in dozens or hundreds of these informal courts. He knows how this works. He calls the two disputants forward. They stand reluctantly and approach the center of the courtyard. Everyone else forms a rough circle around them, creating an arena for the conflict to play out. There's no judge in the formal sense, no single authority who will issue a verdict. But there are witnesses. Everyone here is a witness. And whatever resolution emerges will carry the weight of community consensus. The elder asks the first man to state his case. The man does so, speaking clearly, trying to control the emotion in his voice. He explains that he's lived in his compound for 20 years, that the boundary wall between his property and his neighbors has always stood in a specific location. That last month, his neighbor began construction on a storage room, that the new construction extends past the traditional boundary by approximately 6 inches, that he asked his neighbor to correct this, that his neighbor refused, that he now brings the matter before the community for resolution. His presentation is simple, factual, designed to make his position seem reasonable and his neighbor's behavior seem unreasonable. He's not yelling. He's not making dramatic accusations. He's just explaining what happened, what he believes the facts are, why he thinks the community should support his position. This is how you present disputes in Mesopotamia, calmly, factually, with respect for the collective judgment of your neighbors. The second man responds. He tells a different story. He agrees that construction occurred. He agrees that a storage room was built, but he insists that the boundary has always been ambiguous, that the exact location of the property line has never been formally established, that his construction falls well within what he believes to be his legitimate property. He suggests that his neighbor is making trouble over nothing, that 6 inches of wall shouldn't matter, that neighbors should be able to work out minor differences without involving the entire community. The two accounts contradict each other. Both men speak calmly. Both present themselves as reasonable people dealing with an unreasonable neighbor. Both appeal to fairness, to tradition, to the community's sense of what's right. You watch and listen and realize that truth, in the objective sense of what actually happened, is almost irrelevant. What matters is which story the community finds more convincing, which man presents himself better, who has more social credit from past behavior, who seems more reasonable in this moment. The elder who called the disputants forward now asks if anyone has information relevant to the case. This is the moment when witnesses speak, when neighbors who've observed the situation offer their perspectives. Several people respond. An old woman who lives nearby says she remembers when both compounds were first built. Says she's certain the boundary has always been where the first man claims it is. A younger man supports the second disputant. Says he helped with the storage room construction. Says they were careful to stay on the right side of the property line. The testimonies contradict each other. The witnesses are describing the same physical reality, but interpreting it differently, or remembering it differently, or possibly lying to support neighbors they're allied with. You can't tell which, maybe all of those things simultaneously. Memory is unreliable. Self-interest shapes perception. Social bonds influence testimony. The search for objective truth gives way to the reality of competing narratives, each supported by some witnesses, each plausible enough to warrant consideration. More people speak. Some offer direct observations about the boundary. Others talk about the character of the disputants. He's always been fair in his dealings. Someone says about the first man, he helped my family during the harvest failure 3 years ago. Someone else says about the second man. The dispute about 6 inches of wall becomes a referendum on the entire social standing of both men. Their reputations are being assessed publicly. Their past behaviors weighed. Their community value calculated. You say nothing. You're too new to have relevant information, too marginal to have an opinion that matters. But you're expected to be present, expected to witness, expected to participate in the collective judgment, even if your participation is mostly silent. Observation. This is how neighborhood justice works. Everyone present, everyone aware, everyone complicit in whatever resolution emerges. The discussion continues for what feels like hours, but is probably only 30 or 40 minutes. People eat while they talk. Beer jars circulating, keeping the atmosphere from becoming too tense. The combination of serious business and casual eating creates a strange tone. Part trial, part dinner party, part community meeting. Nobody's pretending this is purely formal justice. Everyone knows this is also social performance, an opportunity to reinforce bonds and demonstrate wisdom and participate in collective decision-making. Finally, the elders confer among themselves. 3 old men, heads together, speaking in low voices, weighing the testimonies, considering the characters of the disputants, calculating what resolution will satisfy the most people and create the least ongoing resentment. They're not looking for perfect justice. They're looking for acceptable compromise, for a solution that both men can live with. Even if neither is completely happy, the eldest speaks. His judgment is that the boundary should be formally marked in a way that splits the disputed distance. 3 inches each side. Neither man gets everything he wanted. Both men lose something, but the loss is equal. Is fair in the sense that both suffer the same small defeat. The elder explains that neighbors must live beside each other for years, probably for life, and maintaining peace is more important than winning disputes. 3 inches each side. The boundary will be formally marked with stones set in the ground where everyone can see them. The decision is made. Both men nod acceptance. Neither looks happy, but both understand that fighting the judgment would be worse than accepting it, would mark them as troublemakers, as people who value their individual grievances above community harmony. They agree to the boundary marking. They agree to split the cost of the stones. They agree, basically, because the alternative is social death. The gathering applauds lightly. not celebrating anyone's victory, but acknowledging that resolution has been reached, that the process worked, that the community successfully negotiated a conflict without violence, without permanent rupture, without one party being completely crushed. This is success. Not because justice was perfectly achieved, but because peace was preserved. The meal continues. People eat more fish, drink more beer, discuss other matters. The dispute fades into the general noise of community life. In a few days, the boundary stones will be set. In a few months, most people will forget the specifics of what happened. But the memory that disputes can be resolved through communal meals, through public discussion, through collective judgment, that memory remains. That memory is the foundation of urban order. Later in the evening, you observe another kind of negotiation. Two families sitting near each other. Not by accident, they're discussing marriage. Not formally, not yet, but exploring possibilities. The families have a son and a daughter of appropriate ages. The families are compatible in status and resources. A marriage would benefit both sides, creating alliance, pooling resources, establishing kinship, where previously there was only neighborly connection. The discussion happens in low voices, casual seeming, embedded in the general socializing of the meal, but everyone nearby is aware of what's happening. Everyone watches peripherally while pretending not to. Because this negotiation, if successful, will reorganize social relationships throughout the neighborhood, will create new obligations, new alliances, new networks of mutual support. The families are assessing each other, not just wealth, though wealth matters. They're evaluating behavior. How does this family conduct itself at gatherings? Are they generous with food and beer? Do they honor their obligations? How do they treat lower status neighbors? Do they drink too much and become problems? Are they reliable, trustworthy? The kind of family you'd want connected to yours through marriage. You watch the parents watching each other while they eat. The conversation is about farming, about irrigation schedules, about completely mundane topics, but underneath the surface talk. Evaluation is happening. Both sides are performing competence, demonstrating that they're worthy partners, showing that their family would be a good addition to the other family's social network. The feast provides the venue for this performance. The meal creates the context where evaluation can happen naturally, where behaviors reveal character, where family dynamics become visible. The young man and young woman in question sit quietly nearby, knowing they're the objects of negotiation, but having no voice in the process. Their preferences, their attractions, their desires. These are irrelevant, or at least secondary. Marriage isn't about individual happiness. Marriage is alliance, is strategy, is the merging of family resources and obligations. The young people will marry who their families decide they'll marry. And probably they'll be fine. Probably they'll develop affection over years of shared life. Or at least they'll develop functional cooperation, which is close enough. You think about your own potential marriage prospects. If you stay in this city long enough to establish yourself, to accumulate enough social capital to be worth marrying into, these feasts are where such negotiations happen, where families assess each other, where alliances are formed through careful observation and even more careful performance. You're being evaluated constantly, even when you're not aware of it. Your behavior at every feast contributes to your reputation, your marriageability, your value in the social marketplace. Across the courtyard, you notice a merchant from another district attending this neighborhood gathering. He's not a resident here. His presence is notable, unusual enough to attract attention. He's seated carefully, not too close to the most important families, but not so far away as to be insulting. Exactly in the position that communicates, I'm a visitor. I'm welcome. I'm useful. I'm not claiming to belong here. He's served the same food as everyone else. This is important. This is the message. We treat visitors fairly. We don't poison foreigners. We can be trusted. Every bite he takes without dying is advertisement for this neighborhood as reliable, as safe to do business with. Tomorrow he'll return to his own district and mention casually that he was treated well here, that food was shared without reservation, that business arrangements might be possible, that trust could develop, but he doesn't know all the local rules. He drinks beer at a moment when others are quiet, waiting for an elder to speak. His timing is wrong. People notice. Nobody corrects him. He's a visitor, and visitors are forgiven their ignorance. But people notice, and they remember, and when the next foreign merchant visits, his behavior will be influenced by the memory of this one's small errors. The burden of representation, where your individual actions reflect on everyone from your group, is heavy, is inescapable. As the evening deepens and the meal gradually transitions into the dispersal phase, where people begin to leave in hierarchical order, you think about what you've witnessed. Dispute resolution through dinner, marriage negotiations over fish, cross-district diplomacy conducted through beer sharing. The feast isn't just a meal. The feast is the operating system of urban society, the platform where all the important business of collective life gets conducted. Court systems exist. Formal legal procedures with judges and written codes and official sanctions. But those are for serious crimes, for matters that threaten the entire city, for everyday disputes, for the constant small conflicts that arise when 40,000 people live in close proximity. The feast serves as courthouse. The meal serves as legal procedure. Community consensus serves as verdict. This system works because everyone knows they'll face judgment eventually. Everyone knows their behavior is being observed, recorded in the collective memory of their neighbors. Everyone knows that today's witness might be tomorrow's disputant. The feast creates accountability through visibility, through the impossibility of hiding your actions when everyone eats together regularly. You walk home through darkening streets, past houses where families are settling for the night, past the occasional late straggler, also heading home from the neighborhood gathering. The evening was exhausting in that particular way, that social obligations are exhausting, where you haven't done physical labor, but your mind is tired from constant awareness, constant performance, constant navigation of social complexity, but you're also satisfied. You witnessed justice of a sort. You saw community functioning. You observed the mechanisms that hold the neighborhood together, that prevent every boundary dispute from escalating into violence, that create frameworks for resolving conflicts without destroying relationships. This is what civilization looks like at ground level. Not monuments or laws or great works, but this, people eating together, talking together, judging together, deciding together how to maintain peace and order and mutual obligation. In a few months, there will be another gathering. Maybe you'll have a dispute to bring forward. Maybe you'll be a witness in someone else's conflict. Maybe you'll be one of the families being evaluated as potential marriage allies. You'll participate in the feast, in the meal, in the ongoing social performance that converts food into justice, eating into diplomacy, shared bread into communal bonds. The cycle continues. The feast happens. The judgments are made. The marriages are negotiated. The obligations accumulate. And through it all, through this endless succession of shared meals and public performances and collective decisions, the city holds together, not through force, though force is available when needed, not through wealth, though wealth influences outcomes, but through the whispered negotiations and public judgments and careful performances that happen every time people sit down to eat together. You reach your dwelling, tired and full and socially exhausted. Tomorrow there will be work. The day after, more work. The normal rhythm of urban life. Grinding grain and hauling water and doing whatever labor sustains your existence here. But in a few months, there will be another feast, another gathering, another opportunity to participate in the collective life of the city, to perform your role, to contribute to the social mechanisms that make it possible for 40,000 people to live together without constant violence. This is the bargain. This is what you get for living in a city. You surrender privacy. You surrender the right to resolve conflicts privately. You surrender control over major life decisions like marriage. But in exchange, you get justice. You get protection. You get access to the collective resources and knowledge of thousands of people. You get to be part of something larger than yourself. Whether that's a good bargain depends on your perspective, on your temperament, on what you value. But it's the only bargain available. The feast is mandatory. The performance is required. The obligations are inescapable. You can participate willingly or reluctantly, but you will participate, because the alternative is exile, is removal from the social networks that make survival possible, is being cut off from the very systems that turn a collection of individuals into something approaching a community. The feast as politics, the meal as courthouse, eating as the foundation of justice and alliance and all the complex social arrangements that cities require. It's not elegant. It's not efficient by modern standards, but it works. It works well enough that cities survive, that populations grow, that civilization itself becomes possible, one meal at a time, one judgment at a time, one marriage negotiation at a time, slowly, publicly, endlessly. The feast continues. The obligations accumulate. The city endures. 2 weeks after the neighborhood feast where you witnessed the boundary dispute, you're called upon to fulfill an obligation you didn't realize you'd incurred. A neighbor, someone you barely know beyond nodding acknowledgement in the street, appears at your dwelling in the morning. She explains that her family is hosting a small gathering. Nothing major, just a meal for their daughter's coming-of-age ceremony. Your presence would honor them. Your attendance would be appreciated. This is not an invitation. This is a summons. This is the obligation economy in action, the invisible ledger being balanced. You attended the neighborhood feast 2 weeks ago. You ate food provided by the collective. You witnessed the dispute resolution. You participated in communal life. And now participation demands reciprocation. You must attend this family's gathering, must witness their ceremony, must eat their food and thereby acknowledge your ongoing membership in the social network that makes urban life possible. You agree. Of course, there's no other acceptable response. Refusing would mark you as antisocial, as someone who takes from the community without giving back, as a person whose future request for help or witness or support would be remembered and possibly denied. So you smile. You express gratitude for the invitation that isn't really an invitation, and you promise to attend. The woman nods, satisfied, and moves on to notify the next household on her list of required attendees. This is how it works. This is the aftermath of every feast. The obligations created don't disappear when the meal ends. They ripple outward, creating networks of debt and duty that can be called in at any time, that accumulate over years, that eventually become so complex that nobody can fully track who owes what to whom. You just know that participating in community meals creates obligations, and those obligations must be honored when called. And refusing to honor them means exile from the very networks that make survival possible. You spend the day thinking about these obligations, about the invisible web of social debt you've been accumulating since arriving in this city. Every feast attended is debt incurred. Every shared meal is investment in social capital that may or may not pay dividends later. You're building a reputation slowly through attendance and appropriate behavior and meeting obligations when they're called in. But you're also becoming entangled in networks you don't fully understand, committed to people you barely know, obligated to attend gatherings you might prefer to skip. This is the price of civilization. This is what it costs to be part of a community rather than an isolated individual. Your time is no longer fully your own. Your calendar is determined partly by your own needs and partly by the social obligations that others can invoke. You attend because you must attend. You participate because participation is mandatory. And in exchange, you receive the right to invoke similar obligations from others when you need help, when you host your own gathering, when you require witnesses or support or assistance. The evening of the coming-of-age feast arrives. You walk through streets now familiar, past houses and courtyards you've learned to recognize, toward a family compound you've never entered before. The smell of cooking food guides you as much as your knowledge of the address. Lamb. You think someone is roasting a lamb, which is expensive, which signals that this family is spending considerable resources on their daughter's ceremony, which creates pressure on everyone attending to reciprocate with similarly generous hospitality when their own important occasions arrive. The gathering is smaller than the neighborhood feast you attended earlier. Maybe 20 families, perhaps 30 people total, intimate by feast standards, though still large enough to be public, to have witnesses, to create the sense of communal participation that validates the ceremony. The daughter being honored stands near her mother, looking uncomfortable in ceremonial clothing, probably wishing this would be over quickly, but understanding that suffering through public attention is part of becoming an adult. The usual rituals proceed. Brief prayers, symbolic offerings, acknowledgement that this girl becoming woman is now ready to assume adult responsibilities in the community. She's 13, which makes her an adult by local standards, old enough to marry, to work full adult labor, to participate in decision-making within her family. The ceremony marks this transition, makes it public, creates witnesses who can testify that, yes, she's now an adult. Her actions now carry adult consequences. She can no longer claim the protections of childhood. Food is distributed. The lamb is indeed lamb, roasted carefully, seasoned with herbs that are expensive and probably imported. The family is demonstrating their resources, showing that they can afford quality food for important occasions, sending signals about their status and their expectations for their daughter's marriage prospects. This isn't just feeding people. This is advertising. This is demonstrating value in the marriage market. You eat slowly, the lamb tender and flavorful, better than anything you've eaten in weeks. The family's investment in this meal is substantial, probably represents savings accumulated over months, resources diverted from other needs to create this moment of public generosity. They're buying something with this meal. buying reputation, buying status, buying the obligation that everyone here now owes them, obligation that can be called in when their daughter marries, when they need help with some project, when they require witnesses or support for any reason. The girl's father stands and speaks. Not long. The speeches at these gatherings are brief because everyone's attention span is limited and people came to eat, not to listen to lengthy orations. He thanks everyone for attending. He expresses hope that his daughter will grow into a respected woman, will marry well, will bring honor to her family. He asks the community to witness that his daughter is now an adult, to remember this moment, to treat her accordingly from this day forward. Everyone murmurs approval. Everyone eats. The ceremony is complete. A girl has become a woman through the simple act of declaring it so in front of witnesses while providing lamb and bread and beer. The biological reality of her maturation is irrelevant. What matters is the social recognition, the public acknowledgement, the collective agreement that yes, from this moment, she is an adult. The feast makes it real. The shared meal validates the transformation. As eating continues, conversations drift to other topics, the usual subjects, irrigation and flooding, harvest prospects, temple politics, family alliances. Nobody discusses the girl directly. That would be impolite now that she's an adult and can hear what's being said about her. But people discuss marriage prospects in general. The quality of recent unions, families looking for suitable partners for their children. The girl's availability is advertised through absence of mention, through the understood fact that her coming-of-age ceremony means her family is now open to marriage negotiations. You watch the social machinery operate. Families with sons of appropriate age. Note this new availability. Families with daughters being honored at similar ceremonies in coming months. Observe how this one was conducted, what was served, how much was spent, what impression was created. Everything is data. Everything is information that feeds into the complex calculations of marriage strategy and alliance formation and social positioning. The meal extends through evening, not as long as major feasts, but longer than casual family dinners. The family must demonstrate that they can afford to feed people for several hours, that their resources allow for sustained hospitality. Leaving too quickly would suggest you're bored or disapproving. Staying too long would suggest you're taking advantage of their generosity. There's a window, invisible but real, when departure becomes appropriate. You watch for signals from higher status attendees. Follow their lead. Leave when they leave. As you walk home through darkness now complete, you think about the obligations you've created tonight. You ate this family's lamb. You witnessed their daughter's coming of age. You participated in making her adult status socially real. They can now call on you for reciprocation when they need witnesses for something, when they host future gatherings, when they require support in disputes or negotiations. They can invoke tonight's shared meal as the foundation of obligation. This is how the web grows. This is how networks form. One meal at a time, one small obligation at a time, until everyone in the city is connected to everyone else through chains of debt and duty that stretch back months or years. You can't trace all the connections. Nobody can, but you know they exist. You know that every feast attended creates invisible threads that bind you to others, that can be pulled at any time, that obligate you to respond when called. The next morning, you wake thinking about failure, about what happens when feasts go wrong. when the social machinery breaks down, when obligations aren't met or hospitality is insufficient or the delicate balance of generosity and expectation collapses. You've heard stories. Every neighborhood has stories about feasts that went wrong, about families whose reputations never recovered from a single failed gathering. There's the family 3 districts over where the beer ran out. A major feast, dozens of families invited, and the host had miscalculated. Halfway through the evening, the beer supply was exhausted. People went home thirsty, insulted, angry at the breach of basic hospitality. That was 10 years ago. People still talk about it. That family never recovered socially. They're marked permanently as the family who couldn't provide enough beer. Their children have difficulty finding marriage partners. They're excluded from important gatherings. One failed feast destroyed their social standing for a generation. Or the merchant who served spoiled fish, not intentionally. He'd been assured by the fishermen that the catch was fresh. But something had gone wrong. The preservation had failed, and half the guests at his feast became violently ill. Nobody died, but the reputation damage was catastrophic. Nobody trusts his hospitality now. Nobody accepts his invitations. He's effectively exiled without leaving the city, cut off from the social networks that make commerce possible. His business has suffered accordingly. Failed feast, failed life. These stories circulate as warnings, as reminders that feasts are serious business, that the stakes are high, that failure isn't just embarrassing but potentially catastrophic. You prepare for feasts with genuine anxiety, knowing that your entire social standing rides on having enough food, on the beer being good, on nothing spoiling or running short or going wrong in any of the 1,000 ways that meals can fail. This is why feast preparation takes days, why people obsess over details, why quality control is paranoid and excessive, why beer is tasted multiple times, why bread quantities are calculated and recalculated, why fish is checked obsessively for signs of spoilage, because the cost of failure is too high, because one bad feast can erase years of careful reputation building, because in a city where social capital is the only reliable form of wealth, losing face means losing everything. You think about your own eventual feast, whenever that might be. You'll need to host eventually. Reciprocity demands it. All these meals you're attending, all these obligations you're incurring, they'll need to be repaid. You'll need to provide food and beer and hospitality at a level that matches what you've received. This thought creates anxiety that sits in your stomach like undigested bread. How will you afford it? How will you calculate quantities correctly? How will you avoid becoming one of those cautionary tales about failed hospitality? But you also think about what survives, about the elements of Mesopotamian feast culture that will persist long after this civilization collapses. Long after cuneiform stops being written and ziggurats crumble into dust, the communal meal as social technology, as the platform for conducting civic business, as the mechanism for creating and maintaining obligations. This survives. You can see echoes of it everywhere in modern life. If you know to look, church potlucks where community members bring dishes to share, where social bonds are reinforced through eating together, where disputes get quietly resolved and alliances get quietly formed while passing casseroles and talking about weather. These are Mesopotamian feasts, stripped of explicit religious ritual, but maintaining the same social function. Bringing food, sharing food, creating obligation through participation, using meals as the context for community business. Thanksgiving dinners where extended families gather, where social hierarchies are performed through seating arrangements and serving order, where younger generations watch and learn unspoken rules about who matters and how to behave in groups. The family members who host take on enormous stress, obsessing over having enough food, over preparations being perfect, knowing that failure will be remembered and discussed for years. This is Mesopotamian feast anxiety, transported 4,000 years into the future and across an ocean. Company picnics and office parties where attendance is technically optional but actually mandatory, where not attending mocks you as antisocial and damages your career prospects, where social capital is built through visible participation and appropriate behavior. These are feast obligations in corporate form. The food is different. The context is different. But the underlying social mechanics are identical to what you're experiencing here in ancient Uruk. Neighborhood barbecues where residents gather, where the quality of your contribution gets noticed and remembered, where being the person who brings store-bought cookies when everyone else made food from scratch marks you as insufficiently invested in community, where disputes get addressed informally, where alliances form, where social order is maintained through the soft power of shared meals and collective judgment. Mesopotamian neighborhood feasts, renamed but not fundamentally changed. The Mesopotamians didn't invent communal eating. Obviously, humans have been eating together since before humans were humans, since our pre-human ancestors shared food around fires. But the Mesopotamians turned it into system. They bureaucratized it. They created formal structures around the informal practice of sharing food. They made the invisible visible through record keeping, through religious ritual, through the deliberate construction of obligation networks. They understood something that modern culture has partly forgotten and partly denies. That every meal shared creates obligation. That hospitality is never free. That eating together is a form of contract, binding participants in networks of reciprocal duty. Modern culture pretends that dinner invitations are casual, that declining is no big deal. That attendance creates no obligation beyond maybe bringing wine or writing a thank you note. But underneath the polite fictions, the old mechanisms still operate. People remember who attends their events and who doesn't. Reciprocity is expected. Social capital gets built or destroyed through participation or absence. The Mesopotamians were just more honest about it. They wrote it down. They kept records. They made explicit what modern culture leaves implicit. You ate my food. You owe me. I attended your feast. You'll attend mine. We're bound together through shared meals, through witness participation, through the accumulation of obligations that neither of us can fully escape as long as we remain part of the same community. As the weeks pass and you attend more gatherings, host no feasts yet, but accumulating obligations that eventually must be repaid. You settle into the rhythm of urban feast culture. You learn to read the social signals. You learn which families are allied with which, who's feuding with whom, where the power centers are, how disputes get resolved, how marriages get negotiated. You learn by watching, by listening, by participating in the endless cycle of shared meals that constitute the social life of the city. The feasts blend together in memory after a while. Individual meals become indistinguishable, merging into a general impression of eating fish and bread and drinking beer while navigating social complexity. But certain moments remain distinct. The boundary dispute where community judgment split the difference. The coming of age ceremony where a girl became woman through declaration and lamb. The foreign merchant whose small timing error revealed his outsider status. These moments stick because they illustrate principles, because they teach lessons about how the system works. You're becoming Mesopotamian, slowly, through the accumulation of shared meals and witnessed obligations. Your initial foreignness is fading. People are learning to recognize you, to know your face, to have opinions about your reliability and your potential value as an alliance partner or witness or source of support. You're being integrated into the community one feast at a time, one obligation at a time, until eventually the question of whether you belong here stops being a question. You belong because you participate. You belong because you eat the food and acknowledge the obligations and attend the gatherings that are mandatory but never called mandatory. Late one evening, after yet another neighborhood feast, you sit alone in your dwelling thinking about what you've learned, about the whispered rituals that give this entire series its name. The rituals weren't loud or dramatic. They weren't the chanting priests or the formal ceremonies. They were the quiet negotiations, the subtle signals, the unspoken agreements that happen in the spaces between official proceedings. The whisper when someone indicated which family was looking for marriage partners. The quiet aside where obligation was acknowledged and reciprocation promised. The subtle shift in seating that signaled the dispute was being resolved or an alliance was forming. The careful avoidance of certain topics that might cause offense. The knowing glance when someone behaved inappropriately. These were the real rituals. These were the mechanisms that made the system work. Not the dramatic moments, but the subtle ones. Not the official ceremonies, but the informal negotiations. Not what was said loudly, but what was communicated quietly. Through gesture and position and careful word choice and deliberate omission. The feasts were theater. Yes, but the real action happened in whispers, in the quiet spaces, in the unspoken agreements that bound people together more firmly than any explicit contract. You think about the future, about the feasts that will happen after you're gone, after everyone currently alive in Uruk is dead and forgotten. The specific people will change. The specific disputes will be different. The marriages being negotiated will involve different families, but the structure will remain. The feast as social technology will persist because it works, because it solves real problems, because it creates the bonds that make urban life possible. Thousands of years from now, you imagine, people will still gather to eat together. They'll still use meals as the context for conducting social business. They'll still create obligations through shared food. They'll still negotiate marriages and resolve disputes and form alliances while breaking bread together. The details will change. The technology will advance, but the fundamental human need to mark important moments with communal meals, to use eating as the medium for creating social bonds, that will remain. The feast is older than civilization, but civilization made it systematic, made it bureaucratic, made it the foundation of urban order. The Mesopotamians took the simple human pleasure of eating together and transformed it into complex social machinery that could organize thousands of people, could create obligations that spanned generations, could maintain order without constant violence. They turned dinner into diplomacy. They turned bread into binding contracts. They turned beer into social glue. As you finally drift toward sleep, exhausted by another day of navigation through social complexity, through obligation and reciprocity, and the endless performance of appropriate urban behavior. You hear faint sounds from nearby courtyards, grinding stones, always grinding stones. someone preparing grain for tomorrow's bread. The sound is familiar now, comforting in its constancy. The grinding continues. The bread will be made. The feasts will happen. The obligations will accumulate. The whispered rituals will bind people together in networks of mutual dependence that make cities possible. This is civilization, not the monuments or the laws or the great works that will be remembered by history. But this, the feast, the gathering, the slow, patient construction of social order through thousands of shared meals, the whispered agreements and quiet negotiations and subtle signals that convert strangers into neighbors, neighbors into community, community into something approaching society. The grinding stones fall silent. Someone has prepared enough flour for now. Tomorrow the work begins again. Tomorrow there will be more obligations to fulfill, more gatherings to attend, more food to share, more bonds to create and maintain. The cycle continues. The feast endures. And through it all, through this endless succession of meals and obligations and performances, the city holds together slowly, quietly, through whispers, through rituals so subtle they're almost invisible, through the patient accumulation of shared food and mutual debt that makes urban life possible. One meal at a time, one obligation at a time, one whispered agreement at a time. The feasts will continue long after you're gone, long after this city crumbles, long after Mesopotamian civilization collapses and cuneiform stops being written, and the gods whose names are invoked at every gathering are forgotten. The feasts will continue because humans need them, need the structure they provide, need the obligations they create, need the social bonds that form when people sit together and eat together and agree tacitly that yes, we are community, we are connected, we are bound by these meals we share. This is the legacy, not written in clay tablets or carved in stone monuments, but preserved in human behavior, in social patterns, in the persistent understanding that important things happen when people eat together. The whispered rituals of ancient Mesopotamian communal feasts echo forward through time, shaping how humans gather, how communities form, how societies maintain themselves. The names change, the languages change, the specific foods change, but the fundamental pattern remains. Share food, create obligation, build community, one meal at a time, slowly, quietly, forever.